Welcome, gentle soul, to another peaceful journey through the corridors of time. I'm delighted to have you here as you settle into your comfortable space tonight. I hope this story can serve as a calming companion. Before we begin our voyage, when most people imagine medieval monasteries, they envision silent figures in rough brown robes, heads bowed in prayer, moving ghost-like through dimly lit corridors. And while there's truth in that image, it barely scratches the surface of what was truly one of history's most fascinating and complex societies. You see, these weren't just places of worship and meditation. Medieval monasteries were vibrant centers of learning, innovation, and industry. They were self-contained worlds where the sacred and the practical intertwined in ways that would shape the course of European civilization. Behind those imposing stone walls lived communities of remarkable individuals who preserved knowledge, advanced medicine, created art, and quietly revolutionized agriculture and technology. Yet their daily lives were governed by rules so strict, so demanding, that modern minds can barely comprehend the discipline required to survive. In the hours ahead, we'll step through the heavy wooden gates of these remarkable institutions and discover what life was truly like for those who chose to abandon the outside world entirely. We'll walk the shadowy cloisters where scribes labored by candlelight to copy manuscripts that would otherwise be lost forever. We'll visit the infirmaries where monk physicians practiced medicine centuries ahead of their time. And we'll meet some of the extraordinary individuals who called these places home, from brilliant scholars who preserved Greek philosophy to humble gardeners who developed new strains of crops that would feed thousands. But before we enter those sacred halls, let us paint the scene. Picture, if you can, a sprawling complex of stone buildings nestled in a green valley somewhere in medieval France, perhaps in the year 1150. Dawn is breaking over the countryside, and a single bell tower rises above morning mist that clings to the surrounding hills. Massive walls enclose gardens, workshops, dormitories, and chapels, creating a community that is entirely self-sufficient. As the first light touches the bell tower, a single bronze bell begins to toll, calling the brothers to the first service of the day. One by one, dark figures emerge from various buildings, moving silently through covered walkways toward the great church at the heart of the complex. They are men who have sworn away their worldly possessions, their freedom, and often their very names, in service to something they believe is far greater than themselves. This is the world of medieval monasticism, a world of extraordinary discipline punctuated by moments of profound creativity and discovery. As we'll see, it was a world that demanded everything from those who entered it, yet gave back gifts that would enrich all of humanity. So let your breathing slow and your muscles relax as we prepare to experience monastic life as it truly was, in all its austerity and wonder, its hardship and transcendence. Our journey begins with understanding the intricate web of rules, traditions, and hierarchies that governed every moment of monastic life, from the moment a novice entered the gates until the day he was laid to rest in the monastery cemetery. Brother Thomas of Canterbury arrived at the Abbey of St. Benedict on a cold November morning in 1142, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning desire to leave the world behind. Born the third son of a minor noble family, Thomas had watched his older brothers inherit lands and titles, while he faced a future of dependence and insignificance. The monastery offered him something the secular world could not: a chance to matter, to contribute to something eternal, and to find purpose in a life of service and scholarship. But Thomas quickly discovered that monastic life was far from the peaceful retreat he had imagined. The rule of St. Benedict, which governed daily life at the abbey, was more demanding than any military code. The brothers rose at 2 a.m. for the first prayer service, called Matins, gathering in the cold church to chant psalms by the light of flickering candles. After matins came lauds at dawn, then prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and finally compline before the community retired to between these prayer services. Every moment was accounted for with work, study, and meals, eaten in complete silence, while one brother read aloud from sacred text. Thomas learned that speaking was permitted only during designated hours and only about necessary matters. Casual conversation was forbidden entirely. Instead, the brothers developed an elaborate system of hand signals to communicate basic needs. A finger pointed to the eye meant look, a hand cupped to the ear meant listen, and touching the heart indicated something related to prayer or devotion. Breaking the rule of silence earned punishment that could range from additional manual labor to being excluded from meal. Thomas's cell was barely 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, containing only a simple wooden bed, a small table, and a peg for hanging his single spare robe. The walls were bare stone, and in winter, ice would sometimes form on the inside of his tiny window. Yet Thomas gradually discovered that these harsh conditions served a purpose. The silence allowed him to hear his own thoughts with unprecedented clarity. Most importantly, the shared hardships bonded the community together in ways that comfort never could. As Thomas advanced from novice to full brother, he was assigned to work in the monastery scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated by hand. This was considered one of the most important duties in the abbey, as books were incredibly rare and valuable. A single Bible might take a team of scribes an entire year to complete, and the finished product would be worth more than a night's war. In the scriptorium, Thomas learned that the monks weren't just copying text. They were actively preserving and expanding human knowledge. When classical Greek and Roman texts arrived from Byzantium or Islamic Spain, the brothers would carefully translate them into Latin, often adding their own commentaries and insight. Aristotle's philosophy, Galen's medical treatises, and Ptolemy's astronomy all survived the Dark Ages largely because of the dedicated work of monastery scribes. Thomas proved particularly skilled at illumination, the art of decorating manuscripts with elaborate coloured designs and miniature painting. Using pigments made from crushed minerals, gold leaf, and even powdered pearls, he would spend weeks creating a single decorated initial letter. His specialty became depicting scenes from the lives of saints, each figure carefully researched from multiple sources to ensure accuracy. But the scriptorium was more than just a copying centre. It was a laboratory of innovation. When parchment became expensive, the brothers experimented with new writing surfaces, eventually developing improved techniques for making paper from rags and plant fibers. They invented new types of ink that wouldn't fade over time and designed more efficient quill pens that could hold more ink and write more smoothly. They even developed new systems of punctuation and chapter divisions that made books easier to read and reference. Like many abbeys, St. Benedict maintained an extensive library that served as a research centre for the surrounding regions. Local nobles would send their sons to be educated by the monks, and even bishops and kings would consult the abbey's scholars on complex theological and philosophical questions. The monastery's influence extended far beyond its walls through its innovative agricultural practices. The brothers had turned thousands of acres of wilderness into productive farmland using techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. They developed new crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility, bred improved varieties of livestock, and created elaborate systems of irrigation and water management. The surplus food they produced fed not only their own community, but also provided relief during famines that regularly devastated medieval Europe. Perhaps most remarkably, the monastery operated what was essentially the region's primary hospitals. Brother Thomas often assisted in the infirmary, where monk physicians practiced medicine that combined traditional herbal remedies with innovations borrowed from Islamic and Byzantine sources. They performed surgical procedures, set broken bones, and treated everything from battlefield wounds to childhood diseases. Their medical library contained treatises in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, making them among the most knowledgeable physicians in Europe. The brothers operated water-powered mills for grinding grain and fulling cloth, workshops for metalworking and wood carving, and laboratories for developing new techniques in everything from brewing to glassmaking. They were among the first in Europe to use mechanical clocks, which allowed them to maintain their precise schedule of prayer services even on cloudy days. Yet for all their practical achievements, Thomas and his fellow monks never forgot that their primary purpose was spiritual. The medieval monastery was designed as a foretaste of heaven on earth, a place where human beings could live in perfect harmony with divine will. Every aspect of monastic life was intended to strip away worldly distractions and focus the soul entirely on God. The brothers' daily prayers weren't just religious obligations, they were acts of intercession for the entire world. Medieval people believed that the monks' constant prayers literally held back the forces of evil and chaos, maintaining the cosmic balance that kept civilization from collapsing into barbarism. The monastery's magnificent church, with its soaring arches and jeweled windows, was conceived as a representation of the heavenly Jerusalem described in the Book of Revelation. Every carved stone, every painted panel, every precious ornament was chosen to lift the mind from earthly concerns toward divine contemplation. The music that filled the church during services, the haunting plain chant that had been refined over centuries, was believed to echo the songs of angels. Brother Thomas spent 37 years at the Abbey of St. Benedict, rising through the community's hierarchy to become master of the scriptorium, and eventually prior. He oversaw the copying of hundreds of manuscripts, the education of countless students, and the spiritual development of several generations of monks. When he died in 1179, he was buried in the monastery cemetery beside dozens of brothers who had become his true family. His life represents both the typical and the extraordinary aspects of medieval monasticism. Like thousands of other monks, Thomas had surrendered personal freedom and comfort in exchange for security, purpose, and community. But he had also participated in one of history's most successful experiments in alternative living, a system that preserved learning through the Dark Ages, pioneered agricultural and technological innovations, and created islands of stability in an often chaotic world. The influence of monasteries like St. Benedict extended far beyond the medieval period. The universities that emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries grew directly out of monastic schools. The scientific revolution of the later Middle Ages built upon research begun in monastery libraries and laboratories. Even modern concepts of disciplined scholarly research, collaborative learning, and institutional preservation of knowledge can be traced back to the methods developed in medieval monasteries. Yet the monastic movement also represented something more fundamental, proof that human beings could organize themselves around shared ideals rather than mere survival or conquest. At a time when most of Europe was dominated by feudal warfare and political instability, the monasteries demonstrated that communities based on mutual support, intellectual curiosity, and spiritual. This wasn't to say that monastic life was perfect or that all monasteries lived up to their highest ideals. Like any human institution, they struggled with problems of corruption, complacency, and abuse of power. Some abbots became wealthy and worldly, more concerned with political influence than spiritual leadership. Some monasteries accumulated vast estates and ruled over their peasant tenants as harshly as any feudal lords. But at their best, medieval monasteries represented something unique in human history. National advancement. They were places where a peasant's son could become a renowned scholar, where innovative technologies could be developed for the benefit of all, and where the accumulated wisdom of centuries could be carefully maintained for future generations. The decline of the monastic movement began long before the Protestant Reformation officially ended it in much of Europe. As medieval society became more complex and urbanized, the monastery's role as the primary center of learning and culture was gradually taken over by universities, guilds, and royal courts. The rise of new forms of spirituality, particularly the mendicant orders orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans challenged the monastery's emphasis on withdrawal. So, by the 14th century, many monasteries had become wealthy institutions more concerned with managing their extensive properties than with spiritual development. The Black Death devastated monastic communities, killing experienced monks faster than they could be replaced and disrupting the careful balance of prayer, work and study that had sustained the movement for centuries. Yet the legacy of medieval monasticism continued to influence European culture long after the last abbey was dissolved. The disciplined approach to scholarship developed by monastic scribes, the agricultural innovations pioneered by monastery farms helped support the population growth that made the Renaissance possible. The architectural techniques developed for monastery churches influenced centuries of European building design. Most importantly, the monastic movement demonstrated that alternative ways of organizing society were not only possible but could be highly successful. At a time when most people assumed that life was inevitably nasty, brutish and short, the monasteries proved that human communities could be built around principles of mutual intellectual development and spiritual. They showed that education could be valued for its own sake, that technological innovation could serve human welfare rather than military conquest, and that diverse groups of people could live together in harmony despite differences in background. Temperament. As you drift towards sleep tonight, let your mind linger on those quiet cloisters where generations of dedicated individuals worked by candlelight to preserve the learning of the past. Think of Brother Thomas and countless others like him who traded worldly success for the deeper satisfaction of contributing to something greater than themselves. In their story, we find not just a fascinating chapter of medieval history, but a reminder that human beings at their best are capable of creating communities based on wisdom, compassion, and hope, rather than fear, greed, and violence. The monastery bells have long since fallen silent, and the great stone buildings have either crumbled to ruins or been converted to museums and hotels. But the spirit that animated those communities, the belief that knowledge should be preserved, that innovation should serve humanity, and that people can choose cooperation over conflict, remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Perhaps in their quiet dedication to learning and service, the medieval monks have something still to teach us about how to live meaningful lives in an often chaotic world. Rest well, knowing that throughout history there have always been those who dedicated their lives to preserving what was best about human civilization and passing it on to future generations. Their patient work continues in laboratories and libraries, schools and hospitals, wherever people gather to learn, to heal. Like the monastery bells that once marked the hours of prayer and work, their influence echoes across the centuries, reminding us that even in the darkest times, the light of human wisdom and compassion continues to shine. I'd love to know where you're joining me from tonight and what brought you to seek solace in these ancient tales. And if you find comfort in these nighttime wanderings through history, consider subscribing for more serene journeys into forgotten worlds. And now let yourself sink deeper into comfort, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your mind to drift away into the mysterious and contemplative world